crossing. Imagine approaching a railway crossing and seeing that the barrier is already down. The warning lights are flashing and the train is coming. At that point, there is really nothing to think about, so you stop. But on this particular day in Russia, one driver apparently decided that he could still make it across. And the dashcam behind him captured the exact moment that decision went horribly wrong. The Mitsubishi was approaching a railway crossing when the warning lights were already active. But instead of waiting, the driver accelerated. He was trying to get across before the train could arrive. However, the train immediately hit the car. The vehicle was damaged by the impact. The driver and the passenger were both dead on the scene. The train did survive the collision with nobody aboard being injured. However, the same couldn't be said for the passengers and the driver in the car. The sudden drop-in. You're driving normally, you're watching the road ahead, and then suddenly something falls from the sky. It's not a piece of debris, it's not a sign, it's a person. Traffic was moving normally along EDSA in Kuzan City. The driver had no reason to expect anything unusual. Then suddenly, something fell from the elevated railway platform above them. It landed directly in the middle of the road and there was no time to react. The car hit the person before the driver could stop. Other vehicles slammed their brakes as the scene quickly erupted into chaos. Other people got out of their cars, bystanders rushed toward the road, but the person who had fallen had already died. The victim was a college student who had fallen from the northbound platform of the LRT station. Now, obviously, due to this dashcam footage, the driver couldn't be charged for this crime. The driver just couldn't do anything in that situation. The tram incident. And somehow another driver wasn't the only person who thought they could beat the train. This time, there isn't even a car, it's just one person on an electric scooter. It was a late evening in St. Petersburg. A young man was approaching the tram crossing on a rental electric scooter. And the trams were already moving through the intersection and everything about the situation was telling him to slow down. He continued towards the track at the normal speed. And then he did something that makes this footage almost painful to watch. He entered the railway crossing with the tram right in front of him. And at that moment, he turned his head and actually saw it. But at that moment, there was nothing he could do. The tram ran over him, killing him on the spot. Investigators reportedly found no mechanical failure with either the scooter or the tram. It all came down to a split-second decision not to wait. This case left a chilling reminder for everybody to be careful at railway crossings. The sinkhole in Seoul. This next video almost looks unbelievable. Cars were moving through an intersection, nothing seemed wrong, then suddenly the road itself starts disappearing. This happened in Seoul. Traffic was moving through an intersection when the pavement suddenly began collapsing. The white car ahead barely managed to escape from the edge. However, the motorist behind him wasn't so lucky. The ground opened beneath him and immediately swallowed him. The dashcam captures other drivers immediately hitting the brakes as they just realized what just happened. But then the situation gets even worse. More of the road begins to collapse and water begins flooding in the opening. The rescue operation lasted hours. Teams eventually had to drain the area and bring in heavy equipment. They found the motorcycle first, then the man's phone, and eventually they found the man. The 30-year-old motorist was ultimately confirmed dead. The cause of the sinkhole remained under investigation. The woman in the road. The road looked completely clear. No traffic, no obstacles, nothing unusual. Then the driver notices something directly in the middle of the road. And by the time he actually realizes what he's looking at, it's already too late. The dashcam footage was recording an ordinary drive along a multi-lane road in China. The car was moving normally, then something suddenly appeared ahead. A woman was sitting directly in the middle of the road. She wasn't walking across, she wasn't standing aside, she was simply sitting there facing oncoming traffic. The driver had no time to react and the vehicle struck the woman, killing her on impact. There were no other vehicles immediately around her, no explanation as to why she was sitting in the middle of the road. And just like that, we're left with footage and a very disturbing question of why was the woman in the road in the first place. The camel encounter. A traffic stop is usually the last place you would expect something deadly to occur. The driver gets out, the officer starts talking to him. It's more of a routine task. Then suddenly, the two men are fighting on the ground. This incident happened in Georgia. A man had been pulled over for speeding. The officer asked him to step out of the vehicle, which he initially complied. But the situation quickly became tense as the officer tried to arrest the man. The driver argued that he should only be receiving a ticket. However, the disagreement escalated. The traffic officer tried to control him, but the man resisted. The struggle then became physical. The officer quickly deployed his taser, but it didn't stop the man. Instead, the struggle continued until the driver managed to overpower the officer. Now the officer, in fear for his life, drew his firearm and fired. The man was instantly killed. The dashcam and bodycam footage captured the entire encounter. After the incident, investigators quickly discovered something that made the story considerably more complicated. The man behind the wheel was Leonard Curey, and he had spent 16 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit, and he had only been released a few years earlier. Now, this would explain why he resisted arrest. His family filed a lawsuit accusing the officer and the sheriff's office of using excessive force. But prosecutors reached a very different conclusion. While reviewing the footage, they discovered that the officer had genuinely feared for his life, and the course of action he took next was justified. The officer in question didn't face any charges. The fiery evening. It was October 17, 2022 in Yeysk, Russia. Residents were going about the evening when something appeared above the buildings. It was moving fast, and then it struck a 9-story apartment building. The impact quickly triggered a massive explosion. Flames spread throughout the building, smoke poured from the upper floors, and debris was thrown across the surrounding area. And suddenly, people who had been inside the apartment started running out for their lives. But some residents were trapped on the upper floors above the fire. They couldn't get down. The smoke and flames had blocked their path, and they were left with only one option, which was jumping off the building. Several people did, and some of them died. Eventually, the reason for the disaster became clear. The object wasn't a missile, it wasn't an unexplainable aircraft. It was an Su-34 jet fighter. The aircraft had been on a training flight when one of its engines reportedly caught fire during takeoff. The pilots lost control of the aircraft, and luckily both of them managed to eject before the crash. The aircraft, however, continued towards the residential area. It struck the apartment building while carrying all its remaining fuel. Emergency crews arrived and began evacuating the area. Hundreds of people had moved from the area. When everything had settled down and the fire was extinguished, 15 people had unfortunately lost their lives and several were left injured. Hundreds of residents were left needing temporary accommodation. Investigators later focused on the aircraft's technical failure of the engine as the major cause of the entire incident.